Hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. Today we are discussing the Netflix documentary FIFA Uncovered. So briefly, FIFA Uncovered narrates the origins of FIFA from its humble beginnings to now corrupt billion-dollar organization. So for those of you who haven't heard, every 4 years the world comes to a complete standstill as the world and its greatest players compete to become a soccer champions of the world. Tasked with organizing the greatest show on earth is FIFA. And according to this documentary, the appearance of legitimacy, coupled with the idealism of sport, continues to give these officials free rein to make as much money as possible. And FIFA's history of corruption is a very long one, but it pretty much became impossible to ignore when they auctioned off the 2018 and 22 FIFA World Cup games to not one but two countries that defied all logic. So the world pretty much gathered together. They brought their best of the best. They brought the likes of Bill Clinton, David Beckham, Prince William. Everybody brought their A game in hopes of, securing their country as the host. And as soon as the winners were announced, you could tell, I don't think it would have been as bad if everyone wasn't sitting there at the same time thinking wow, we never really stood a chance. So this was pretty much like the beginning of the end. And despite everything, FIFA still is managing to outsource its responsibility to the host countries, in this case, Qatar. So ultimately, for those of you criticizing Qatar, it's a symbol, FIFA in general is just a symbol for all things wrong with the business of competitive sport. These kind of excessive, mega overpriced, merchandise selling, events that have become just too big to fail. And FIFA, as well as many other massive, sporting events, notably Formula One, make it clear that the world is opening up. So more and more countries want a chance to host these events. So the competition is pretty fierce. It's not the same as it was 10 years ago. And some of the backlash seems to be rooted in the assumption that football has no place in the Middle East. And this is not true, right? Football is a cultural force like no other, and it transcends boundaries, it transcends borders. And the issue isn't bringing the World Cup to the Middle East. The issue is who was tasked with that responsibility. And so in my opinion, Qatar hosting is not a dark moment in FIFA's history. In fact, FIFA is a dark cloud that continues to hang over the sporting universe. And the corruption with FIFA, especially if you watch this documentary, you're just sitting there how is it still alive? So through wiretaps and, intense investigations, they found that it's not a few bad apples. This wasn't one or two people doing this. FIFA had normalized the corruption of bad behavior. And you essentially have to burn the whole place down for us to take you seriously. And the mechanisms that allowed people to get away with things are still in place. It's like bed bugs. You can't just burn the sheets. You gotta burn everything down. And somehow FIFA is surviving, and their narrative is really interesting because I guess the logic now is as long as we host it in a good country, it's not corrupt. Somehow by hosting it in the US or in Canada, it'll erase FIFA's past. That seems to be the attitude here. I don't really like it because it makes it seem okay, all FIFA has to do is get through this time, get through this World Cup, and everything will be back to normal. And honestly, that's not really that far from the truth. The reason that FIFA survives is that it's essentially synonymous with soccer, right? The idea that FIFA and soccer are the same thing. One cannot exist without the other. And FIFA has done a great job of standing behind Qatar, right? They're saying, we're still trying to bring football to the world and we're trying to do all these things, but this whole football to the world thing is just an easier way to auction it off to more people, right? They don't actually care about bringing FIFA or the World Cup to the world. And it's really sad that much of the backlash is going to the host countries and not the organization that, has been problematic long before this. To these countries, I guess host at your own risk. So before I begin my breakdown, I couldn't believe they got everybody to talk. There was no one on this documentary that was remotely believable. The whole time they were speaking, I was is this real life? They look like they couldn't wait to get on camera and just talk a bunch of nonsense. So the whole time they're talking, I'm And everybody was talking like as a matter of fact, like, listen, I knew the whole time, but it was like they're talking in like this weird objective way, and I'm just like, where were you? You know, like, isn't that your responsibility? Like, I was just confused in terms of like the accountability. And at the end of this documentary, I just kept thinking like, wow, like FIFA really is a force because it's still standing. The documentary starts off with the origins of FIFA. It's small, you know, according to the documentary, it was a small organization devoid of politics. You know, ideally, it was supposed to be seen as a force for good. And this whole force for good thing in itself is propaganda. Like, FIFA was never a force for good. And I recently read a very thought-provoking article in the New York Times called Why the World Cup Belongs to the Middle East. I've linked it down below. And it highlights the origins of organized football, which is tied to the history of colonialism and also the struggle against it. So, you know, one of the things the article highlights is the fact that British and French officials introduced football as efforts to cultivate obedience and discipline among its like colonized people. And the case, one of the examples it uses is Algeria. So for those of you who don't know, Algeria's independence movement, known as the FLN, formed a team in exile in 1958 as part of their battle against France. And the team competed against other national teams even before it was an independent Algeria. And under pressure from France, like FIFA punished teams that played matches with the FLN logo. So when you actually kind of look at it, it was never a neutral organization, you know. So originally, when you think about it, it was a politically corrupt organization that eventually became a financially corrupt organization. So when the financial and the political kind of consummated their relationship, well, it all began in 1974. When the president of FIFA was challenged by former Olympic swimmer and Brazilian businessman, Mr. Havelange. He saw the potential FIFA had not only to be powerful, but to make billions of dollars. And his strategy was in order to kind of win the presidency of FIFA and start his very long reign, was to kind of highlight the current president's attitude towards apartheid South Africa, saying he's a colonizer. You know, like, I'm not a colonizer, I just want money. So this narrative that he was able to use to secure the presidency is something that like has basically made FIFA what it is today, right? This promise of, you know, we're gonna give your countries resources so you could develop soccer, and FIFA's main objective is to make soccer accessible to everyone around the world. And this narrative and lie is an ongoing theme that FIFA presidents continue to use to secure votes and sponsorships, right? This FIFA for all. This narrative is what keeps its pulse going. And I think what struck me the most is, besides Mr. Havelange and Sepp Blatter, like, there's nobody else that really almost challenged their reign, right? It doesn't seem like they had any term limits. It didn't seem like there was any checks and balances. So I was just like, can we just talk about that? That in itself is just like, burn it down. To strengthen his power, Mr. Havelange hired Sepp Blatter, and it was Sepp's job to secure sponsorship. So as soon as Sepp was introduced into the process, he is what made FIFA like as big as the Olympics, right? Suddenly he was able to secure these massive sponsorships, and then things just started to blow up from there. And I think the brilliance in their strategy was how they used politics to maintain the propaganda that sports should be neutral and that soccer is a symbol of that neutrality, right? Like, soccer is what brings us together, and in the end we have more in common than we think we do. And it's a really unfortunate narrative. And what's worse is that they were able to kind of manipulate their corruption or distract from their corruption, because the idea is that all this money, right, like all these sponsorships, like, this is a good thing. You know, with all the money that we have, we can develop soccer around the world and, you know, make it a force for good. And this is a powerfully dangerous narrative, because at face value, you want it to be true. They managed to kind of manipulate an otherwise corporate strategy into a humanitarian one, right? Again, like football for all. And, you know, all this money, like the idea that they were donations to fund this amazing tournament and develop football around the world, when in fact it was just like a corporate body that's just ridiculously unchecked. You know, like when you actually think about how powerful the narrative is and like the power of soccer, it's really crazy. Anytime something is sponsored, it's never neutral, right? Like we thought there was something wrong, and then once Adidas got involved, we knew there was something wrong. So the trial run to see if they could get away and solidify this narrative was the 1978 World Cup in Argentina. And according to the documentary, during this time, Argentina was kind of going through a dark period. The government was rounding up dissidents. It was just a very violent and uncertain time in Argentina. Meanwhile, the way FIFA justified coming to Argentina was that, listen, sport is neutral and the show must go on, right? Like this politics is none of our business, right? Like we're here to bring soccer to all. And this was the first trial run and it worked. And what made things worse is that Argentina won the World Cup. And according to this documentary, like 500 meters away from the stadium was like a military school where people were being tortured and killed and all this stuff. And, you know, Argentina having hosted the World Cup games, you know, in part, it's such a distraction, right? It's such a massive world event that it was able to successfully separate itself from the politics that was going on behind the scenes. Separation between politics and sport in Argentina is equated to the 1936 Hitler Olympics. And the way the documentary frames it is really interesting because it highlighted for me not so much how horrible these regimes are, but how powerful like sport is, like the idea of sport, right? And it can be used as like reverse propaganda because there's a certain legitimacy and a certain power that money can't buy, right? And if you're able to be seen as hospitable enough to host this prestigious games where, you know, only the world's best comes, then you can't really be that bad, right? Because at the end of the day, it's like, how can we not watch? So sport in itself and the way we view sport is that powerful, right? Like it actually does bring us together, but there are people, unfortunately, that manipulate this image, you know, unknown to us, right? Like people, it does matter. The success of the Argentinian games, all hell broke loose and everybody wanted a cut. So FIFA started establishing these dummy committees and they started selling off all the rights, right? They were like, listen, we're going to sell marketing rights, whatever it is, as long as FIFA gets a cut, we're good. So it kind of opened up the door and, you know, money just started flowing in. What FIFA was really good at is, again, like establishing these weirdo committees within FIFA to check itself, to make it look like they were actually like overseeing things when in fact they were just doing that to get away with things. Like that part just really blew my mind. The more powerful FIFA got, the more power hungry its officials became, specifically Sepp Blatter. And this guy, he's on the documentary and he just blew my mind. I'm just like, who is this guy? So he basically got tired of waiting and said, you know what, I want to become the president. And the FIFA presidential election in itself is pretty intense. Like the division of votes, every country gets a vote, but it's really interesting because certain, I guess, regions found a way to make themselves more powerful. So according to the documentary, you know, the selling sponsorships and everything is going smoothly, right? You have this narrative of football for all. Meanwhile, they're making millions of dollars and nobody's really seeing the discrepancy. And selling sponsorships is one thing, selling marketing rights is one thing, but someone got the bright idea, like, let's sell these games, right? Like, why are we doing it? This is small time business. Let's just sell the whole thing. And somebody somewhere brainstormed that, you know what, actually these votes to decide who hosts the World Cup, they don't have to be neutral. We don't have to care. We can put a dollar value on it. And this somebody was a man named Chuck Blazer from Team USA. And he was basically described in the documentary as this kind of juvenile, like novice. Like he basically was just, you know, hosting his local community's soccer teams. And then he decided to go big time. And so this was his opportunity. So he's like, okay, well, let me just carve out this career in football. And he started brainstorming. So he managed to convince the president of CONCACAF, I'm not pronouncing it right, but basically the part, like the region responsible also for America's votes, like that group, and said, listen, we're a sleeping giant, right? He's kind of alerting everyone like, listen, these votes, somebody's got to control the process, and that might as well be us. And he essentially pitched to the president of that organization at that time, like, let's get this money. Like, what are we waiting around for? No one else is going to lead, so let's lead for them. And this Jack Warner, his kind of partner in crime, like, this guy is the epitome of self-preservation. I think that's the thing that got me about FIFA, was that, like, literally everybody was looking out for themselves. Like, as soon as the investigation started to get more intense, I think Jack Warner, like, it's to the point where he had his sons money laundering for him. Like, this was a very cartel-like business. And the police gave him the option. They're like, listen, your sons are going to go to jail. So either, give up your diplomatic immunity and we can talk. He literally was like, listen, he wished his sons well. And he booked it back to Trinidad. Like, he booked it back to the Caribbean. He was just like, I'm out. So again, like, everybody here is looking out for their own best interests, and the mechanisms to do so were in place early on, right? It was always a place for people to do whatever they felt like doing. When you think about it, like, promising the World Cup, so why sell off the World Cup? Like, you have to spend so much money building these stadiums, you have to spend so much money promoting it, but they make it back in droves, right? Again, there's a certain legitimacy that money can't buy, and promising the World Cup is a way of promising money, right? Money and fame and a good reputation. So it generates not just income, but like prestige, right? Like, again, there's just something that money can't buy here. And it's an amazing opportunity. When you look at FIFA, when you look at the Olympics, like, these are amazing opportunities to build your reputation, to have people from all parts of the world come, and you can kind of change the stereotype, right? Like, you have this one shot to make an impression. So it's a shot that people want to take. So the documentary outlines one of the many Bring Football to the World programs. So FIFA would have all these programs around the world, and people would donate into them. And in the documentary, they highlight Kenya. And the reporter, the clip that they took, he was basically saying, yeah, so there were supposed to be stadiums here, there was supposed to be this and that, and there ain't nothing here. So where's the money, right? And FIFA's whole thing was like, listen, we're bringing football to the world. It's not our fault that poor countries are corrupt. That's not our issue. And that's their whole thing, right? Like, we're doing the best we can, but at the end of the day, we can't control independent states, right? And this separation between the ideal and, like, the reality that they claim not to know is just really interesting to me. What made FIFA particularly just trash over time is how, again, they made themselves synonymous with football. And because of that, again, they're able to get away with a lot, and case in point being South Africa. So South Africa, the documentary highlights South Africa. South Africa is both everything right and wrong with FIFA and the World Cup, right? The symbolism was huge. What better way to show the world that you're bringing football to everyone by hosting it in a former apartheid state? Like, South Africa, the buzz, the image, the perception was amazing. And a lot of that has to do with the perception of FIFA itself, right? Like, how could FIFA not have soccer's best interest at heart? Like, this is such a sacred position. Like, how, like, to a lot of people, again, like, FIFA is synonymous with soccer. So they see soccer as like something greater than life. And so FIFA is also that. And so FIFA officials understood this, and they play on the emotional impact of soccer fans, right? Like, they, as a distraction, right? They kind of manipulate and change the narrative to move it away from them. So the campaign to host South Africa was amazing, right? Like, they're showing Nelson Mandela. He's going around with FIFA officials. They're parading this man around. He looks exhausted. And seeing him with FIFA, it felt natural, right? You're like, that's amazing. Two of the greatest forces for good coming together. We love to see it. Like, you have FIFA, which is soccer, and Nelson Mandela, who's freedom, and together they're just going to host this amazing tournament. And who wouldn't want to support that? South Africa, in a lot of ways, was the perfect backdrop, right, to solidify this FIFA as a force for good. And, again, they had all these dummy funds. So one of the things the investigation found was that $10 million was donated into one of these funds meant to help develop football around the world. And later the investigation found that a lot of the funds that were going to, that were said to go to helping South Africa develop, were actually going into the pockets of voting members to secure South Africa as the host country. So that in itself is just really abominable, right? Because again, hosting the World Cup is very exciting for people and the general population there, and they're thinking their lives are going to change, but as soon as the World Cup leaves, nothing really changes, right? So that's something to think about. I think South Africa had a domino effect, which led to the beginning of the end, right? Like South Africa, the reason they were able to kind of get away with that is because of the image of South Africa. You're like, wow, like that's amazing that they're hosting it there. Like, who isn't going to watch the games in South Africa, you know? Which leads to today. So this takes us to the present day times. So how did Qatar get the World Cup? So much attention is now being given to Qatar, but not to the governing raggedy body who sold it to them. So the intersection between politics and football is most clearly seen in Qatar's campaign to secure the World Cup. So up until this point, the narrative of bringing football around the world has been enough. But and it's still pushing, but it's kind of hard to take them seriously at this point. According to the documentary, Qatar's campaign was not great. First, there's a lot of countries you could have hosted this games in, but Qatar is actually the least equipped for many reasons. First, they're very small. Second, they have no stadiums. So in a lot of countries, the infrastructure is there. They have stadiums. They might have to upkeep and do some things, but in this case, the stadiums were not there. The infrastructure was not there. And the basic facilities, not just in terms of the stadium, but how are you going to support the fans that are coming? Where are they going to stay? Like, how are you actually going to do this? And so that's bad enough. And then on top of that, you have the weather. So normally FIFA is hosted in the summer months. So it's like, how are you going to host in 45-degree weather? So by every stretch of the imagination, again, like it was just really hard to believe, you know, by any standard. You're just like, you know, and I think I was reading like even the amount of money they spent is like astronomically more than other countries over the years. So it was just like a real stretch of the imagination. So once Qatar was given the World Cup, I don't think FIFA imagined the backlash. I think they were trying to stay ahead of it. They tried to spin the narrative. I like watching Sepp Blatter try to bring peace to the Middle East. It was like corruption at its finest. They're like, sir, since when? So they were really trying to spin it, you know. And again, the issue isn't bringing the World Cup to the Middle East. It's the way they did it. It just seemed like, you're like, what is going on here? Like, the math ain't mathin', y'all. The documentary outlines a few things. So I'm going to outline how the documentary says it secured the World Cup and then give you my thoughts on it. So according to the documentary, one of the reasons that they were able to secure the World Cup is because of a man named Mohammed bin Hammam, a long-standing member of FIFA and close friends with Sepp Blatter. Basically, once he got involved, things started changing for Qatar, right? He knew how the system worked. He's been part of the system for a very long time, and he knew what needed to get done to secure these votes. He knew how corrupt these people were. So he's like, listen, y'all are never going to secure these votes unless you do this, this, and this. And I think his reasons for doing it weren't entirely selfless. Like, again, nobody has challenged the FIFA president. Like, it took a gun to his head for him to step down. That's a whole other issue. So, you know, to challenge his reign, like, you basically have to secure a World Cup, right? So I think a lot of the push was in hopes of maybe getting somebody else up there and trying to spin things around. And what Mohammed was able to do is get them to work smart and not hard. The documentary interviews a woman named Phaedra, and you tell me how believable these people are. Like, I'm sorry to say, I don't believe anybody in this documentary. Like, I just feel like people were mad once they got kicked out, but like, you were always corrupt. Like, I didn't really care for anyone in this documentary, but anyways. So she claims that members of the executive committee were coming through to the delegation, you know, with Qatar's delegation, and, you know, money, she didn't see money being exchanged, but essentially the idea was they were convinced that, you know, Africa had a chance to host, so the Arab world should be given a chance to host. And so, you know, there was kind of this silent understanding that, like, in exchange for money, like, the votes would be swinged. And I think what really struck me was like the depths of FIFA's influence, right? It went up as high as you can imagine. So according to the documentary, the president of UEFA was ambushed by the French president, Nicolas Sarkozy, at that time. to secure votes for Qatar in the country's best interest. So apparently they had a meeting and he was like, listen, you need to vote for Qatar because like we need to get this money. Like basically everybody was trying to make money. Like let's just keep it real. And I don't know what the best interest of France has to do with buying soccer teams and giant Airbuses, but I don't see how you can blame Qatar and not France at the same time. So there was a lot at work here to, like, when you look at the behind the scenes, you're like, damn, if you're gonna boycott Qatar, you might as well boycott the whole thing. So Qatar winning left FIFA the most vulnerable it's been in a long time. By FIFA, I mean Sepp Blatter. This guy is like the Machiavelli of sport. You know, he somehow manages to make it about someone else. This someone else being Qatar. So for the first time, he's actually in danger of losing his seat. And in a way, Qatar hosting helped him like leave before he could be arrested. The legitimacy of FIFA, like the fact that Sepp Blatter was sitting there, everything about this man, like I'm sorry to say, like he was like O.J. Simpson, like if I did it. Like he was sitting there like basically outlining his entire evil plan, and you know, he even couldn't believe it. He was like, yeah, like the US wanted me, everybody wanted, but they couldn't catch me. Like I was watching this guy like really? The only person that actually could have challenged his reign was the Qatari national who helped Qatar secure the World Cup, but he was kind of caught up in a bribery scandal, coincidentally, and he had no choice but to withdraw his candidacy. And in withdrawing his candidacy, it's almost like Sepp Blatter, like there was kind of an understanding, it seems, that it was like, okay, well, we're not going to talk bad about Qatar anymore, right? Like the actual like self-preservation and just ruthlessness behind the scenes was something else. So does Qatar deserve the amount of bad press it's getting? Yes and no. Okay, so this issue of migrant workers, it's true. And it goes far beyond stadiums, right? We're talking about basic infrastructure. Just look at Dubai, malls, restaurants. Like this is a very deep system. And in terms of how they import these workers, oftentimes they're in debt, and the passport thing. So your experience is largely curated by your passport. And this is a system that's gone on long before stadiums, right? Like it's gone on for like many generations. And just, we're talking about like a deeply rooted cultural issue because a lot of workers are imported. So basic jobs, for example, the cashier or the person at McDonald's, these are all imported workers. Like they don't really put locals in these jobs. And so people kind of weirdly think that as if this person was trained to become a cashier their whole life. Like they just have a very low opinion of these workers because they don't know anybody who's worked at these jobs. So they kind of see them as less than inherently. So it goes beyond stadiums and migrant workers. It's like how they see these people. And that's an issue that's never been unpacked by the media. And I don't think the people who are the most offended by Qatar hosting the World Cup care about migrant workers. I think it's largely racist and political because this is an issue that's been going on for many years. You know, it kind of reminds me of the Black Lives Matter people who put like black squares on Instagram. Shout out to those people, you know, like same energy. So, you know, even the press coverage, like the whole focus is on stadiums. If you care about migrant workers, you're going to talk a lot more about stadiums. You know, why don't you talk about the malls? Why don't you talk about anything else? Because they're lazy, right? Why should we verify this? They're all barbarians, so who really cares? And you have to be very careful not to demonize an entire region of people. The games do belong in the Middle East. The question is, the problem is who brought it there and under what circumstances? You know, like this is the central issue, and it takes away all nuance from the conversation. And FIFA's attitude is correct in saying that once the games are over, everyone will forget. And they're right. You know, to be honest, like we will forget. People don't care. And it's sad to say, but you know, even the press coverage, again, there's a lot that could be said. Like I'm trying to think of an example, like for example, maids. Like there's a hierarchy within the maids. Like maids from the Philippines are seen as better than maids from say Bangladesh because they raise your kids better. Like there's like, it's really like, you need to understand, like this is not about migrant workers only. Like there's a deep like embedded like it's almost impossible to explain unless you've lived in this region or you're educated about the topic. But just warn people, like again, there's a difference between criticizing Qatar and saying that everybody who lives in the Middle East, they're a bunch of barbarians. Like, this is kind of the tone, and this is wrong. And the media is not really doing anything about it, right? So, like, you got to be careful. And this is the problem with the press coverage, and FIFA's playing on that, right? They've simplified it. They're saying, listen, well, you know, all of this backlash, what does this have to do with soccer? It has everything to do with soccer, because soccer brings everything together, and they just totally corrupted the image of soccer. So, you know, Qatar, it's a back and forth, right? I think ultimately FIFA and sort of the outcome of all this is to alert you to the fact that, again, sports have become too big to fail, and a lot of countries are competing to host, right? Like, it's no longer at the exclusive domain of, you know, British North America, right? And as a result of that, who is accountable for overseeing that everything gets done, right? Especially if you want to bring football for all. And for me, what this reveals is that FIFA never cared. They don't really care how the stadiums are built. They don't really care. As long as they're done and it's fast and it's over. And you can see that in the outcome of all these other countries who spend billions of dollars building these stadiums, and to what end? Like, what was the point? You know, like, what did it bring you? And, you know, it's something to think about. So overall, I thought this was a very interesting documentary. I implore people, like, saying you're not going to watch the games as protest is silly. I think you have to really, there's more you could do. And the advantage here is, if the press was doing it right, like, you would look into this issue, but they will never look into it because it goes beyond Qatar, right? So Qatar has become kind of a scapegoat for everything wrong with FIFA, everything wrong with, and this is wrong. You know, this narrative is wrong, and it's working, and it appeals to the simple, simplistic. And so watching the people in this documentary, I didn't believe anything these people were saying. I'm sorry to say, like, if you left this documentary optimistic because America's hosting the World Cup along with Canada, you're basic. I don't care what you think. Like, this is so silly. FIFA is silly. I was just shocked. Like, I was watching these people, like, how are you not in jail? How is Sepp Blatter not in jail? Like, he is chilling in Switzerland, living his best life. I had nothing to say. So you guys let me know what you think, and until next time.